In the golden fields of Texas, where fortunes rise and fall with the seasons, Jack Coleman's weathered hands tell the story of a man fighting to keep his family's legacy alive. His ranch, once prosperous, now teeters on the edge of foreclosure. That summer afternoon, he spots a woman on the dusty road leading to his land. Her designer dress oddly out of place against the rugged landscape. But it's not her expensive clothes that catch his eye. It's the profound sadness in her distant gaze. Without hesitation, he pulls his horse to a stop and offers her something no amount of money can buy. A chance to outride her troubles, even if just for a moment. What Jack doesn't know is that Sophie Anderson isn't just another lost soul. She's a tech billionaire who left her empire behind, searching for something real. And in this simple cowboy's gesture, she sees the first genuine kindness she's encountered in years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun hadn't yet touched the horizon when Jack Coleman began his daily routine at the Lone Star Ranch. His boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way to the stables, the sound echoing across the empty yard. 20 years ago, these same paths would have been bustling with ranch hands, their laughter mixing with the neighing of horses and the gentle lowing of cattle. Now, it was just him and the ghosts of better days. He paused at his father's old office, now his own, where a stack of unopened letters from the bank gathered dust on the desk. The latest notice, marked urgent in angry red letters, hadn't even made it past the envelope. Jack knew what it said, the same thing they'd been telling him for months. The ranch was drowning in debt, and time was running out. His sister Sarah's voice echoed in his mind from their last phone call. "Jack, you can't keep carrying Dad's dream alone. Sometimes letting go is braver than holding on." But Sarah didn't understand. This wasn't just about their father's dream. It was about preserving a way of life that was disappearing faster than morning dew under the Texas sun. The ranch had been in the Coleman family for 4 generations. Jack's great-grandfather had built it from nothing but grit and determination, surviving drought, depression, and every other challenge the land had thrown at him. His grandfather had expanded it into one of the most respected operations in the county, and his father, Jack's throat tightened at the memory. His father had modernized it, keeping tradition alive while adapting to changing times, until the accident. 5 years ago, a heart attack had taken Thomas Coleman without warning, leaving Jack with a mountain of modernization debt and half-finished plans he barely understood. The timing couldn't have been worse. The market had turned, costs had soared, and one by one the ranch hands had moved on to more stable work, leaving Jack to manage an operation designed for a crew of 20. He walked the fence line now, testing posts and mending wire where needed. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of ranch work, moved automatically through the familiar motions. These same hands had once played guitar at local bars, dreaming of Nashville stages. But dreams had a way of changing, reshaping themselves to fit reality's mold. The horses watched him as he worked, including his father's prized stallion Thunder. The magnificent black horse had been Thomas Coleman's last major investment, part of his vision for breeding championship stock. Now Thunder served as a painful reminder of unfulfilled potential. "We'll figure something out, old boy," Jack murmured, reaching out to stroke Thunder's nose. The horse nickered softly, as if understanding, the weight in his owner's voice. Back in the office, Jack finally forced himself to open the bank notice. The words blurred together, but the message was clear enough. 3 months. They were giving him 3 months to either bring the accounts current or face foreclosure. The amount needed made his stomach turn. More money than the ranch would see in 2 good years, let alone in its current state. Sarah's weekly check-in call came right on schedule. "Have you considered the developer's offer?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent. "You know I can't, Sarah. They'd turn the ranch into another soulless resort. Everything Dad worked for." Dad would want you to survive, Jack. You're barely keeping the lights on. When was the last time you took a day off or went on a date? Life's passing you by, big brother. He ended the call with vague promises to think about it, knowing he wouldn't. Sarah meant well, but she'd chosen a different path, building a successful real estate business in Austin. She couldn't understand that some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight seemed hopeless. As evening approached, Jack sat on the porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The scene before him was worth more than any developer's check. The gentle roll of the hills, the scattered oaks, the distant silhouettes of grazing horses. This was his heritage, his responsibility, his home. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. Equipment that needed fixing, bills that needed paying, and endless tasks that needed doing. But for now, in the quiet of the setting sun, Jack allowed himself a moment of peace. Whatever came next, he would face it the way Coleman's always had, with determination, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to the land that had shaped 4 generations of his family. The stars were just beginning to appear when he spotted movement on the road leading to the ranch, a solitary figure that would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. 48 hours earlier, Sophie Anderson had stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office in San Francisco, watching the fog roll in beneath the Golden Gate Bridge. The view had cost millions, but today it felt like prison. Bars made of glass and steel. On her desk, 3 tablets displayed an endless stream of emails, meeting requests, and crisis alerts. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the Wall Street Journal article hit that morning. Miss Anderson, her assistant, Marcus, appeared at the door. The board members are waiting in the conference room. They're concerned about the acquisition. Rumors. Sophie closed her eyes, fighting back a wave of exhaustion. At 32, she was the youngest CEO of a Fortune 500 tech company, the darling of Silicon Valley, and absolutely miserable. Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes. Around her, Anderson Tech's headquarters hummed with the energy of 3,000 employees, all working to maintain the empire she'd built from a simple coding project in her college dorm room. 10 years of relentless work had transformed that project into the world's leading AI development platform. Now, venture capitalists were circling, smelling blood in the water. The board meeting went exactly as she'd expected. Richard Wells, the senior board member, led the charge. The Meridian Group's offer is very generous, Sophie. $30 billion is well above market value. We're not selling. Sophie's voice was firm, masking her inner turmoil. Anderson Tech's mission has always been about more than money. Our AI ethics framework is revolutionizing the industry. Ethics don't pay dividends, Richard interrupted. The market's shifting. If we don't act now, that $30 billion could become 15 by next quarter. Sophie looked around the table at the faces she'd known for years. Where once she'd seen mentors and supporters, now she saw only shareholders focused on exit strategies. Not one of them remembered the company's original vision, using AI to solve humanitarian crises, not just maximize profits. Back in her office, she found Marcus organizing her schedule. They've added 3 more interviews about the takeover rumors, he said, frowning at his tablet. And your mother called again about the charity gala next week. Sophie stared at her reflection in the window. The woman looking back at her was immaculately dressed in a designer suit, not a hair out of place. She looked exactly like the polished tech CEO everyone expected her to be. And suddenly, she couldn't stand it anymore. Cancel everything, she said quietly. Marcus looked up, startled. I'm sorry. All of it. The interviews, the gala, the meetings. Clear my schedule for the next 2 weeks. But the board will have to wait. Sophie turned to face him, feeling lighter already. I need you to do something for me, Marcus. Something completely confidential. Marcus had been with her since the start. The only person who'd seen both the brilliant CEO and the lonely woman. Behind the success, he set down his tablet. Anything. I need to disappear, just for a little while. No phones, no emails, no crisis meetings. I need space to think. She walked to her desk, pulling up the corporate jet's schedule. Can you arrange that? Understanding dawned in Marcus's eyes. You're having doubts about the sale. I'm having doubts about everything. Sophie sank into her chair. Do you remember why we started this company? The real reason? To make AI accessible and ethical, to use technology to help people, not replace them. Exactly, but somewhere along the way, between the IPO and the quarterly reports and the endless compromises, she gestured at the office around them. I've lost touch with what's real. How can I make decisions that affect millions of lives when I can't even remember the last time I had a genuine conversation with someone who wasn't trying to sell me something or buy something from me? Marcus was quiet for a moment, then nodded. I'll take care of everything. Where should I tell people you are? A private meditation retreat. No phones allowed. Very exclusive. They'll believe that. It's exactly the kind of thing they expect from a tech CEO having a crisis. She managed a small smile. But I'm actually thinking somewhere simpler, somewhere real. Within hours, Marcus had arranged everything. A private flight to Texas, a rental car dropped off at a small airfield, and a cover story that would keep the board and the press at bay for at least 2 weeks. No one would think to look for Sophie Anderson in the middle of ranch country. As she packed a small bag, Sophie caught herself reaching for her usual designer clothes. Instead, she chose the simplest items she owned: jeans, cotton shirts, a dress she'd bought years ago and never worn. The woman in the mirror looked different now, less polished, more authentic. Her phone buzzed one last time. Another message from Richard Wells. Consider the company's future, Sophie. Some opportunities only come once. She turned off the phone and left it on her desk. Marcus was waiting by the private elevator, holding a sealed envelope. Your itinerary and emergency contact numbers. I'm the only one who knows where you really are. Sophie hugged him, surprising them both. Thank you, Marcus, for understanding. Just be careful out there, okay? And find whatever it is you're looking for. The summer sun was setting as her rental car crossed into ranch country. She'd been driving for hours, deliberately taking back roads, feeling the weight of her old life falling away with each mile. When the car's engine began to sputter, then died completely, she couldn't even feel angry. Maybe this was exactly what she needed, a real problem that couldn't be solved with a platinum credit card or a call to her assistant. That's when she saw him, the cowboy on horseback, silhouetted against the golden Texas sky. He pulled his horse to a stop, and in his kind eyes, Sophie saw something she hadn't encountered in years: genuine, unfiltered human connection. Ever ridden before? Jack asked, extending his hand to help Sophie onto Thunder's back. She hesitated for a moment, looking at his calloused palm, so different from the manicured hands she was used to shaking in boardrooms. Not since I was a little girl, she admitted, accepting his help. The warmth of his grip was steady and reassuring as he guided her foot to the stirrup. My grandfather had a small farm in Montana. We used to spend summers there before... She trailed off, surprised by the sudden memory. Before the IPO, before the endless meetings, before she'd become too busy for family vacations. Jack seemed to understand her unspoken words, simply nodding as he adjusted the stirrups to fit her height. Thunder here's got a gentle soul, he said, patting the horse's neck. He can tell when someone needs a friend. The horse nickered softly as if agreeing, and Sophie felt some of her tension ease. Jack swung himself up behind her with practiced grace, reaching around to take the reins. Sophie became acutely aware of his presence, the solid strength of him, the subtle scent of leather and sun-warmed cotton. It had been years since she'd been this close to someone without an agenda. They rode in comfortable silence at first, the rhythm of Thunder's hooves creating a peaceful melody against the packed earth. The setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, transforming ordinary fields into something magical. Out here, far from the city's constant noise, Sophie could hear everything: the whisper of wind through grass, the distant call of birds, even her own thoughts. Sometimes, Jack said quietly, the best way to find your way is to get lost for a while. The words hit home with unexpected force. Is that what happened to you? She asked, surprising herself with her directness. She felt his slight chuckle. Something like that. After my father passed, I thought I had it all figured out. Turns out knowing where you want to be and knowing how to get there are two different things. Sophie nodded, understanding completely. Everyone expects you to have all the answers, and the harder you try to live up to those expectations, the further you feel from who you really are, she finished. They crested a small hill, and Jack drew Thunder to a stop. Below them, the ranch spread out in a patchwork of fields and fences, silvered by the approaching dusk. A cluster of buildings huddled around an old farmhouse, warm lights beginning to glow in the windows. It's beautiful, Sophie breathed, seeing not just the physical landscape, but the heritage it represented. This was something real, something that couldn't be reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet or pixels on a screen. It's home, Jack said simply. Then, after a moment's hesitation, listen, I've got some soup warming on the stove. Nothing fancy, but you're welcome to stay for dinner. Might as well wait for that rental car service to reach you somewhere comfortable. Sophie knew she should say no. She should call for a luxury cab service, head to the nearest five-star hotel, and stick to her original plan for a solitary retreat. Instead, she heard herself say, I'd like that. As they turned Thunder toward the house, something shifted in the air between them. It wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly there. It was recognition, two souls who'd lost their way, somehow finding unexpected understanding on a dusty Texas road. Jack started pointing out various features of the ranch, his voice warming with pride despite the property's visible signs of wear. Sophie found herself relaxing into the gentle cadence of his words, feeling more peaceful than she had in years. For the first time since she'd left San Francisco, she knew she'd made the right choice. Sometimes the long way home led through unexpected territory. The farmhouse kitchen was nothing like Sophie's sleek penthouse, with its professional-grade appliances and minimalist design. Here, well-worn copper pots hung from ceiling hooks, family photos crowded the walls, and the ancient wooden table bore the marks of countless meals shared over generations. Somehow, it felt more like a home than anywhere she'd lived in the past decade. Mind giving me a hand? Jack asked, pulling vegetables from a garden basket without waiting for her designer. Outfit? He tossed her an apron that had seen better days. Figure you can handle a knife. Sophie rolled up her sleeves, surprising herself with her eagerness. I'll have you know I took a cooking class once. She didn't mention it was a private session with a Michelin-starred chef who'd charged more than most people's monthly salary. Jack raised an eyebrow, handing her a knife and some carrots. Well then, chef, show me what you got. Her first few cuts were awkward, nothing like the precise julienne she'd learned, but there was something therapeutic about the simple task, about creating something with her own hands rather than delegating it to others. Jack worked beside her, their elbows occasionally brushing as they fell into an easy rhythm. Your mother's recipe? She asked, nodding toward the simmering pot of soup. A shadow crossed his face. Dad's, actually. He said a man should know how to feed himself properly. Course, he probably didn't expect me to be cooking for myself quite so soon. Sophie's knife paused. I lost my father too. Car accident 6 years ago. He never got to see the company become what it is. She stopped, realizing she'd nearly revealed too much. Jack just nodded, understanding in his eyes. Funny how we keep trying to make them proud, even after they're gone. After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching stars emerge in a sky untainted by city lights. The soup had been simple but delicious, served with thick slices of homemade bread. Sophie couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten something that hadn't been scrutinized by a nutritionist or prepared by a personal chef. You know, Jack said, breaking the comfortable silence, Thunder could use some exercise tomorrow morning, if you're not in a hurry to leave. Sophie thought about her empty schedule, the first truly free time she'd had in years. I'd like that, though you might need to teach me properly. I wasn't exactly honest about my riding experience. It's been more than a few years. His laugh was warm and genuine. Don't worry, we'll start with the basics. Thunder's a good teacher, better than me probably. A coyote called in the distance, its lonely song echoing across the fields. Sophie pulled her borrowed jacket closer, breathing in the unfamiliar sense of hay and horses and open space. Everything here was so different from her world of glass and steel, of artificial schedules and artificial relationships. I should get going, she said reluctantly. Is there a motel nearby? Old Mary's place, about 5 miles down. It's not exactly the Ritz, but it's clean and quiet. He stood, stretching. I'll drive you over. That rental car won't be here till morning anyway. As they drove through the gathering darkness, Sophie watched Jack's profile in the truck's dim light. He was everything the men in her world weren't. Genuine, unpolished, content with who he was, rather than obsessed with who he could become. It was refreshing, and more than a little frightening, because tomorrow she'd have to decide, take the easy path back to her familiar world, or stay and explore whatever this unexpected connection might become. For tonight, though, she let herself enjoy the simple pleasure of possibility, of roads not yet chosen and truths not yet revealed. The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Sophie returned to the ranch each morning, her designer clothes replaced by jeans and boots she'd bought at the local store. Jack found himself looking for her arrival, watching the dust trail of her rental car wind up the long driveway. "You're doing it wrong," she said one morning, finding him at the kitchen table buried in paperwork. Bills and invoices were scattered everywhere, his father's old ledger open to a half-completed page. "Here, let me show you." Before he could protest, she'd pulled up a chair and started organizing the chaos into neat piles. Her fingers flew over the calculator, her mind automatically spotting patterns in the numbers. This at least was familiar territory. "See this feed supplier? You're paying almost double what you should be." She pointed to an invoice. "And your equipment maintenance schedule is bleeding money. If you consolidated the service calls..." Jack watched her work, a mixture of amazement and suspicion crossing his face. "You seem to know an awful lot about business for someone who was just passing through." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "I used to help my grandfather with his farm." "Accounts," she said quickly. It wasn't entirely a lie. She just omitted the part about her MBA from Stanford and her company's agricultural technology division. In the stables, things were simpler. Jack taught her to groom Thunder, showing her how to brush in long, smooth strokes. "Every horse has a story," he explained, demonstrating how to check for signs of stress or injury. "You just have to learn their language." She found herself studying him as he worked, the gentle strength in his hands, the quiet confidence in his movements. Here was a man who knew exactly who he was, even if he didn't know where his future led. Word spread quickly in the small town about the mysterious woman. At Coleman Ranch, Sophie overheard whispers at the local diner when she picked up lunch for them both. "City girl playing cowgirl," one old-timer muttered. "Might be good for Jack," another replied. "Boy's been alone too long since his daddy passed." The guilt grew heavier each day. Every time Jack shared another piece of his life, his fears about losing the ranch, his dreams of honoring his father's legacy, Sophie felt the weight of her deception. Her phone remained off, buried at the bottom of her bag, but she knew the real world was waiting. One afternoon, while Jack was fixing a fence in the north pasture, Sophie found herself in his office again. Her trained eye couldn't help but see the potential. With the right technology, updated systems, maybe some innovative, sustainable practices, the ranch could be more than profitable. It could be a model for modern agriculture. "You don't have to figure it all out alone," she said. Later, as they shared another quiet dinner on the porch, the words slipped out before she could stop them. Jack set down his fork. "Meaning?" "Just, there are options. Resources. People who could..." She stopped, seeing his expression harden. "People who could what? Turn this place into something it's not." His voice was quiet but firm. This isn't just a business, Sophie. It's a legacy. I know that, she said softly. I understand more than you think. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment Sophie thought he saw right through her carefully constructed story. But he just nodded, turning back to his meal. Later that night in her motel room, Sophie finally turned on her phone. Hundreds of notifications flooded in, including a dozen urgent messages from Marcus. The board was getting restless. Rumors of her absence were spreading. Her carefully constructed escape was beginning to crumble. She stared at her reflection in the motel's bathroom mirror. In just a few days, ranch life had changed her. Her skin was sun-kissed, her smile easier, her eyes clearer. For the first time in years, she felt real. But how long could she live in this beautiful fiction before reality caught up with her? The idea had been forming in Sophie's mind for days, taking shape as she learned more about the ranch's operations. She'd spent a lifetime turning struggling businesses into successes. Why should this be any different? Except, of course, that this wasn't just another business acquisition. This was Jack's life, his heritage, and her heart was now tangled up in it all. She found him at sunrise, checking the irrigation system in the east field. The early morning light caught the silver in his hair, and something in her chest tightened. At the sight of him, he smiled when he saw her coming, that same genuine smile that made her forget who she was supposed to be. "You're up early," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Thought city folks like to sleep in. I have something to show you." She pulled out a folder she'd spent half the night preparing. Old habits died hard. She'd created a full presentation, though she'd carefully removed anything that might reveal her true expertise. "I've been looking at your operation, and I have some ideas." Jack's expression turned cautious, but he took the folder. Together, they sat on the tailgate of his truck, shoulders touching as she walked him through her proposals. Simple things. At first, modernizing the record-keeping system, restructuring supplier contracts, optimizing the breeding program. Then the bigger ideas. See, if you converted part of the North pasture to solar panels, you could cut your energy costs by 60%. The government has grants for sustainable agriculture. You'd barely pay anything up front. She turned the page. And here, this section could support a small organic farming operation. There's huge demand for locally grown produce, especially with the farm-to-table movement. She trailed off, noticing his silence. "Jack, this is—" He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "Sophie, these are good ideas. Really good. But this kind of change, it needs money, resources, connections I don't have." "But what if you did?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "What if I could help? I know people—" "Do you?" His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. "Because the Sophie I know has been here less than a week. The Sophie I know is just passing through. Unless there's something you're not telling me." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Sophie's heart pounded. She could tell him now, explain everything, but looking into his eyes, seeing the wariness there, she hesitated. "I just want to help," she said finally, the words feeling inadequate. Jack stood, putting distance between them. "This place, what I do here, it might not look like much to someone from your world, but it means something. My father understood that you can't just throw money at tradition and expect it to survive. Some things need to grow slowly, need to be tended with care. That's not what I—" Sophie stood too, reaching for him. "Isn't it?" He turned to face her, and suddenly they were close, too close. The tension that had been building between them for days crackled in the small space. His eyes dropped to her lips, and for a moment Sophie thought he might kiss her. Her heart stuttered at the possibility. Instead, he stepped back. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this isn't a project to be fixed. It's my life." The rejection stung, both personally and professionally. For the first time, Sophie felt the full weight of her deception. In trying to help without revealing herself, she'd only made things worse. "I should go," she said quietly, gathering her papers. "I'm sorry if I overstepped." As she walked to her car, his voice stopped her. "Sophie." She turned. He was still, standing by the truck, the morning sun haloing his figure. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" The question held more meaning than its simple words. Tomorrow. How many tomorrows did she have left before her real life caught up with her, before the carefully constructed bubble of these past days burst? "Yes," she said, because she couldn't bear to say anything else. "I'll be back." Driving away, Sophie finally checked her phone. 27 missed calls, dozens of texts, but it was the latest message from Marcus that made her blood run cold. "Board called emergency meeting. They're voting on the sale next week. Need you back ASAP." In her rearview mirror, Jack grew smaller, a solitary figure against the vast Texas sky. She had less than a week to find a way to save everything. His ranch, her company, and whatever was growing between them. But how could she save anything when every moment with him was built on a lie? The bank's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, its official letterhead stark against the pile of regular mail. Jack stood in his kitchen, reading and rereading the words until they blurred together. The timeline had changed. They weren't giving him 3 months anymore. They wanted full payment in 30 days, or they'd begin foreclosure proceedings. His hands shook as he set the letter down. Outside, he could hear Sophie in the stable, her voice mixing with Thunder's gentle nickering. She'd become a natural with the horses, as if she'd been around them all her life. The thought of her made his chest tighten, with a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite sort out. "Bad news!" Her voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, hay in her hair, cheeks flushed from the morning work. Looking at her now, you'd never. "I guess she wasn't born to this life." Banks moved up the timeline. His voice was rougher than he intended. 30 days. Sophie's face paled. She moved toward the letter, her eyes scanning the numbers. Jack watched her reading, noting how quickly she processed the financial details, how her fingers twitched as if reaching for a calculator. Just another reminder that there was more to her story than she was telling. "There has to be something we can do," she said, that familiar problem-solving tone creeping into her voice. "Maybe if we—" Jack cut her off. Weeks of suspicion and frustration, finally boiling over. "Sophie, who are you, really? Because every time we talk business, every time we discuss finances, you sound less like someone who's just passing through and more like—" Her phone rang, cutting through the tension. Sophie jumped, pulling it from her pocket. Her face went from pale to ashen as she saw the screen. "I need to take this," she whispered, hurrying outside. Jack followed, not bothering to hide the fact that he was listening. Through the screen door he could hear her side of the conversation. "No, Marcus, they can't call that vote without me. I understand the pressure, but yes, I know how much money is at stake." Her voice had changed, taken on an authority he'd never heard before. "Tell the board I'll be back for the meeting. I just need a few more days to—" She saw him standing there and her voice trailed off. Their eyes met through the screen, and in that moment, all the lies between them seemed to crystallize. "Who are you?" he asked again, softer this time. Sophie ended her call, her hands trembling slightly. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Jack's sister Sarah pulled up in her real estate agent's car, gravel crunching under the tires. "Jack!" Sarah called out, waving a newspaper. "You need to see this. You're not going to believe—" She stopped short, seeing Sophie on the porch. Her eyes widened with recognition. "Oh my God, you're her! You're Sophie Anderson, the Sophie Anderson!" The silence that followed was deafening. Jack looked between his sister and Sophie, confusion turning to understanding, then to something harder. "Anderson," he said flatly. "As in Anderson Tech? The billion-dollar company?" Sophie stepped toward him, her eyes pleading. "Jack, please let me explain." "Explain what? How you've been lying to me this whole time, playing some kind of billionaire tourist in my life?" The hurt in his voice cut through her like a knife. "Was any of it real? Or was this just some kind of charitable project for you? Fix up the poor, struggling rancher?" It wasn't like that, Sophie's voice cracked. Everything I felt, everything between us, that was real. Sarah stood awkwardly by her car, clutching the newspaper with Sophie's. Face splashed across the business section. The headline read, Anderson Tech CEO's disappearance sparks takeover rumors. I should have told you, Sophie said, taking another step toward him. I wanted to, every day. But I was afraid this would happen, afraid you'd look at me differently, like you looked at me. Jack's laugh was bitter. The struggling rancher who just needs the right business plan, the quaint little family farm that could be so much more efficient with the right technology. That's not fair. No? He picked up the bank letter, holding it up between them like a barrier. Were you ever going to tell me? Or were you just going to sweep in with your billions and save me? Add the Coleman ranch to your portfolio of charitable causes? Sophie felt tears burning in her eyes. Everything was unraveling, exactly as she'd feared it would. Jack, please. But he was already walking away, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. I think you should go, he said. Not looking back. Go back to your real life, Sophie Anderson. We both know you don't belong here. The screen door slammed behind him with a finality that shattered something in Sophie's heart. She stood there, watching through her tears as the man she'd grown to love disappeared into the house that held his family's legacy. A legacy now, teetering on the brink of destruction, partly because she'd waited too long to tell him the truth. The local diner buzzed with excitement. Every newspaper on every table showed the same headline, accompanied by photos of Sophie in power suits at tech conferences and corporate events. She looked like a different person in those pictures, polished, pristine, untouchable. Nothing like the woman who'd spent the past week with hay in her hair and dirt on her jeans. Can't believe she was here all along, the waitress said, refilling coffee cups, right under our noses. One of the richest women in America, mucking out stables at Coleman Ranch. Sarah sat across from Jack in their usual booth, watching her. Brother stared into his untouched coffee. She'd tried to explain how this could be good news, how Sophie's connections and resources could save the ranch. But she knew her brother well enough to know he wasn't ready to hear it. Have you seen these numbers? She pushed the business section toward him. Anderson Tech is worth more than the GDP of some small countries. She could buy this entire county without blinking. That's not the point, Jack said, his voice hollow. She lied, Sarah. For days, she let me believe, let me think. He couldn't finish the sentence. Back at the ranch, Sophie stood in the stable, saying goodbye to Thunder. The horse nudged her shoulder gently, sensing her distress. Her designer clothes felt wrong now, constraining and artificial after days of worn denim and cotton. Take care of him for me, she whispered to Thunder, slipping him one last apple. She meant both the horse and his owner, though neither could hear her. Her phone buzzed constantly. Marcus updating her on the board situation, reporters seeking comments, social media exploding with speculation about her disappearance. The peaceful bubble she'd built here had well and truly burst. She was almost to her car when she heard boots on gravel behind her. Were you going to leave without saying goodbye? Jack's voice stopped her. Again? Sophie turned slowly. He stood there in the morning light, looking exactly as he had the day she'd met him. Solid, real, everything her world wasn't. I didn't think you wanted to see me, she said quietly. I don't know what I want. He took a step closer. Was any of it real, Sophie? Or was I just some kind of research project? How the other half lives, a billionaire's perspective. The hurt in his voice broke something in her. You think I could fake this? Her voice cracked. You think I could pretend to feel what I feel for you, for this place? I don't know what to think. The Sophie I knew wouldn't have lied to me for days. The Sophie you knew is who I really am. The words burst out of her. That's what you don't understand. Out here with you, I wasn't pretending. For the first time in years, I was just me, not the CEO, not the tech genius, not the billion-dollar brand, just Sophie. Jack's expression softened slightly, but the wariness remained. And now reality's caught up with us both. She brushed away a tear. My board is voting to sell the company next week. Everything my father and I built, all our dreams of using technology to help people, it'll all be turned into just another profit machine. Sounds familiar, Jack said quietly. Watching something you love, something your father built, slip away. Their eyes met, understanding passing between them. But understanding wasn't enough to bridge the gulf of broken trust. I have to go, Sophie said finally. The vote is in 3 days. If I don't show up, she didn't finish the sentence. They both knew about deadlines and responsibilities now. Well, Jack straightened, his walls going back up. Good luck with your vote, Miss Anderson. I'm sure you'll land on your feet, whatever happens. The formality in his voice cut deeper than anger would have. Sophie walked to her car, each step, feeling like lead. As she opened the door, she turned back one last time. For what it's worth, she said softly, these past few days were the most real thing I've ever known. She drove away with tears blurring her vision, watching in her rearview mirror as Jack grew smaller and smaller until he disappeared completely, just like her dreams of finding something genuine in this complicated world. The San Francisco skyline sparkled through Sophie's office windows, but she barely saw it. 3 days back in her world, and everything felt wrong. The sleek furniture, the endless meetings, the constant ping of notifications. It all seemed hollow now, like a stage set for a play she no longer wanted to perform in. The media's having a field day, Marcus said, scrolling through his tablet. Tech billionaire's ranch romance is trending. Some outlets are calling it a publicity stunt, Sophie winced. The thought of Jack seeing those headlines, believing she'd used him for publicity, made her physically ill. Have the board members arrived? They're waiting in the conference room. Richard Wells is particularly eager to speak with you. Meanwhile, in Texas, Jack threw himself into physical labor, working from dawn to dusk. Anything to keep his mind off her. But everywhere he looked, he saw traces of Sophie's presence, the organized filing system she'd created, the spreadsheet still open on his laptop, the apple cores Thunder kept searching for in the stable. Sarah found him replacing fence posts. In the north pasture, the same spot where Sophie had shared her vision for the ranch's future. You're being stubborn, she said, handing him a water bottle. That woman could save everything Dad built, and you're out here beating yourself up. Instead of calling her. It's not that simple. Jack drove another post into the ground with more force than necessary. You didn't see how she looked at this place, Sarah, like it was a problem to be solved, a business opportunity. No. Sarah's voice softened. I saw how she looked at you. Back in San Francisco, Sophie sat through presentation after presentation, watching her company's future being carved up by people who saw only dollar signs. Richard Wells's voice droned on about market synergies and optimization strategies. The Meridian Group's offer is more than generous, he concluded. With the current market volatility, we'd be foolish not to take it. Sophie stared at the presentation screen, seeing not the projected profits, but Jack's face when she tried to explain her ideas for the ranch. She'd done the same thing these vultures were doing now, tried to reduce something precious to mere numbers. In Texas, Jack finally opened the folder Sophie had left behind. Looking at her careful analysis with fresh eyes, he saw something he'd missed before. She hadn't just proposed changes, she'd found ways to preserve the ranch's heritage, while making it viable. Every suggestion balanced tradition with innovation, respect for the past with hope for the future. Thunder nickered softly as Jack entered the stable, heading straight for the spot where Sophie used to keep her apples. The horse's disappointment was palpable. I know, boy, Jack murmured. I miss her too. Sophie stood at her office window, watching the sun set behind the Golden Gate Bridge. On her desk, the board's documents waited for her signature, papers that would end her father's dream of ethical technology that would turn Anderson Tech into just another corporate machine. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Richard Wells. The vote's tomorrow. Make the right choice, Sophie. She looked at her reflection in the window, seeing not the powerful CEO but the woman who'd found herself on a Texas ranch. The woman who'd learned that some things were worth more than money. Jack sat on his porch, watching his own sunset. The bank's letter lay beside him, its deadline looming. In his hand, he held a small flash drive Sophie had left behind. Plugging it into his laptop, he found detailed plans for saving the ranch, plans that preserved its soul while securing its future. Two people, hundreds of miles apart, watched the same sun sink below the horizon. Both faced losing their father's legacies. Both had decisions to make. Both wondered if some distances, between wealth and simplicity, between truth and lies, between two very different worlds, were too great to bridge. But as darkness fell, both felt the same ache of something unfinished, something that refused to fade despite the miles between them. The morning of the board vote dawned cold and foggy in San Francisco. Sophie stood in her office, watching Meridian Group executives file into the building. Through the glass walls, she could see them glad-handing board members, their expensive suits and predatory smiles, telling her everything she needed to know about their plans for her company. "They're talking about splitting up the AI ethics division," Marcus reported, his usual calm demeanor showing cracks of concern. "Meridian thinks it's dragging down profitability." Sophie's hands clenched. The ethics division had been her father's pride, his way of ensuring technology served humanity rather than exploited it. Over my dead body. Back in Texas, Jack sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by newspaper clippings and printouts. He'd spent the night reading everything he could find about Sophie Anderson and Anderson Tech. What he discovered had shaken him to his core. Anderson Tech pioneers free AI education in underserved communities. He read aloud from one headline. Sophie Anderson refuses billion-dollar defense contract, citing ethical concerns. Another article detailed her fight to keep user data private despite government pressure. This was no corporate raider. This was someone fighting to protect her own legacy, just as fiercely as he was fighting for his. In the conference room, Richard Wells was making his final pitch. "The market is changing, Sophie. Technology isn't about idealism anymore. It's about survival." He gestured to the Meridian Group representatives. "They understand this. They can take Anderson Tech to the next level by gutting everything that makes us different." Sophie's voice cut through the room. "My father didn't build this company to be just another tech giant exploiting user data and chasing quarterly profits." "Your father isn't here anymore," Richard said softly, a calculated hit. "And sometimes letting go is the smartest business decision." The words echoed in Sophie's mind, the same words she'd heard about the ranch, about tradition, about the past. But now she understood something she hadn't before. At the ranch, Jack pulled up Anderson Tech's website. There, in Sophie's founder's letter, he found words that made his breath catch. Technology should preserve what makes us human, not replace it. Innovation without ethics is just expensive destruction. He thought about her suggestions for the ranch, how carefully she'd balanced progress with preservation, efficiency with heritage. She'd seen what he couldn't, that moving forward didn't have to mean leaving everything behind. In San Francisco, the board meeting reached its climax. "The vote is simple," Richard announced. "Accept Meridian's offer, or watch our stock price tumble when they launch their hostile takeover." Sophie stood, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Before you vote, I want to tell you about a ranch in Texas." The board members stirred, confused. The Meridian executives exchanged smirks. "I spent last week watching a man fight to save his family's legacy. He taught me something crucial, that some things are worth more than money, that efficiency without soul is just slow death." She walked to the window, looking out at the city she'd helped shape. Anderson Tech isn't just a company. It's a vision of technology that helps rather than exploits, that builds up rather than tears down. If we sell that vision for a quick profit, we're not just betraying my father's legacy, we're betraying our own future. Jack stared at his laptop screen, at the live stream of Anderson Tech's stock price. The numbers kept falling as rumors of the vote spread. He thought about Sophie, standing alone against the corporate wolves, fighting for what she believed in, just as he'd been fighting all along. With sudden clarity, he realized they weren't so different after all. They were both trying to honor their fathers while finding their own path, both struggling to preserve something precious in a world that only valued the bottom line. He reached for his phone, then stopped. The gesture felt inadequate. Some things needed to be said in person, face to face, with nothing hidden and nothing held back. Thunder whinnied from the stable as if in agreement. Jack stood, decision made. It was time to stop hiding behind pride and start fighting for what really mattered. The ranch road kicked up familiar dust as Sophie's car wound its way toward the farmhouse. She'd left the board meeting without a vote, shocking everyone by declaring a 48-hour recess. Richard Wells' furious objections still rang in her ears, but she didn't care. Some things were more important than corporate protocol. She spotted Jack before he saw her. He was in the stable with Thunder, his movements betraying the tension in his shoulders as he worked. The sight of him made her heart skip. He looked exactly the same, yet everything was different now. Thunder noticed her first, his welcoming. Winnie making Jack turn. Their eyes met across the yard, and for a moment neither moved. "Shouldn't you be in San Francisco?" Jack's voice was carefully neutral. "Saving your company? That's why I'm here." Sophie took a step forward. "Because I finally figured out what I'm really fighting for." Jack set down his brush, giving her his full attention. The air between them crackled with unspoken words. "I saw the news," he said quietly, "about the takeover attempt, about what Meridian plans to do with your company. Then you understand." Sophie moved closer, her designer heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. "They want to strip away everything that makes Anderson Tech different. Everything my father and I built it to be. Like developers wanting to turn this ranch into luxury condos." A ghost of a smile touched Jack's lips. "Funny how some battles look the same, no matter what world you're in." The tension began to ease, just slightly. Sophie reached out to stroke Thunder's nose, drawing comfort from the horse's solid presence. "I lied about who I was," she admitted softly, "but I never lied about who I am. Out here with you, I found parts of myself I thought I'd lost. The girl who used to dream bigger than profit margins. The woman who still believes some things are worth fighting for." Jack was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "Why? Did you come back, Sophie? Really?" "Because running away didn't work. Because I'm tired of letting fear make my choices." She met his gaze steadily. "Because sometimes the only way forward is to tell the whole truth, even if it hurts. The whole truth." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his eyes. "And what's that?" "That I'm a tech billionaire who's terrified of losing her father's legacy. That I'm a CEO who fell in love with a rancher who taught her what really matters." Her voice shook slightly. "That I'm just a woman asking a man to believe that what we found here was real." Thunder nudged them both, as if tired of their hesitation. Jack laughed softly, the sound breaking the last of the tension. "You know what I realized," he said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "We're not so different. We're both fighting to keep something alive, both trying to find a way to honor the past while building a future. And both, too, stubborn to admit when we need help," Sophie suggested, leaning into his touch. "Maybe." His hand cupped her cheek. "Or maybe we were just waiting to find the right partner." The word hung between them, full of possibility. Sophie covered his hand with hers, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and unwavering dedication. "I have to go back," she said softly. "The vote's in 48 hours, but this time I'm not running away. This time I'm asking you to be part of the solution." "For the ranch?" His eyes searched hers. "For everything." She took a deep breath. "My father used to say that the best innovations come from understanding what's worth preserving. I think he'd like what we could build together, if you're willing to try." Jack's answer wasn't in words. Instead, he pulled her close, his kiss saying everything that pride and fear had kept them from expressing before. Thunder snorted and trotted away, leaving them alone in the golden Texas afternoon, two worlds finally meeting in the middle. The farmhouse kitchen had transformed into an impromptu war room. Laptops and tablets covered the old wooden table where Sophie and Jack had shared their first meal, modern technology meeting weathered tradition. Marcus's face flickered on a video call while Sarah sat across from them, her real estate expertise proving invaluable. "The bank won't budge on the timeline," Sarah reported, shuffling through documents. "But they're willing to consider a structured payment plan if we can show immediate viability." "And the board's getting restless," Marcus added from the screen. "Richard Wells is lobbying hard for an immediate vote. He's claiming Sophie's absence is proof she's lost control." Jack watched Sophie work, amazed by her transformation. Gone was any pretense of being a casual visitor. This was Sophie Anderson in her element, but somehow softer than the corporate photos he'd seen, more real. She'd rolled up her sleeves, her designer blouse wrinkled, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail as she typed furiously. "What if we combine the problems?" she said suddenly, looking up. "Jack, your ranch isn't just a ranch. It's a perfect testing ground for sustainable agriculture technology, the very thing Anderson Tech's been trying to develop." Understanding dawned in Jack's eyes. A working prototype. "Exactly." Sophie's fingers flew across the keyboard. "We've been trying to develop AI-driven farming solutions, but we've been doing it in sterile labs. What better proof of concept than a historic ranch successfully integrating modern technology while preserving traditional methods?" "The board would love the PR angle," Marcus mused. "Traditional values meeting modern innovation. And with Jack's experience, we could show it actually works," Jack finished. "Not just theory, but practical application." Sarah leaned forward. "The bank would definitely reconsider their position if Anderson Tech was involved. The publicity alone, no." Jack's voice was firm. "If we do this, it's not for publicity. It's about proving that progress doesn't have to destroy tradition, that you can move forward without losing your soul." Sophie reached for his hand under the table, squeezing it gently. "That's exactly what my father always wanted for Anderson Tech. Technology that enhances humanity, not replaces it." They worked through the night, fueled by coffee and purpose. Sophie's corporate expertise merged with Jack's practical knowledge, creating something neither could have achieved alone. By dawn, they had a proposal that could save both their worlds. "It's not just about solar panels and smart irrigation anymore," Sophie explained, watching the sun rise over the fields. "It's about creating a model for sustainable ranching that other family farms can actually use, something that preserves their way of life while making it viable in the modern world. And Anderson Tech gets real-world application for their technology," Jack added, "proving that ethical innovation can be profitable." The local farmers started arriving as morning broke, drawn by Sarah's calls. Men and women Jack had known all his life, all facing the same struggles he was. Sophie watched him explain their vision, saw how his passion sparked understanding in their eyes. "It won't be easy," one old rancher said, adjusting his hat. "Change never is." "No," Jack agreed, "but neither was it easy for our grandparents to adapt to tractors or our parents to learn computers. We're not destroying the old ways, we're helping them survive." Sophie stepped forward. "I'm not here to turn your ranches into tech showcases. I'm here because a wise rancher taught me that some things are worth preserving. Anderson Tech wants to learn from you as much as help you." The meeting ended with cautious optimism. As the ranchers drove away, Jack pulled Sophie close. "You know Richard Wells won't like this. It's not the clean exit he wanted." "No," she smiled. "It's better. It's proof that Anderson Tech can stay true to its principles and still succeed, just like this ranch can stay true to its heritage and survive." They stood together, watching the morning sun illuminate both the historic barn and the tablet in Sophie's hand. Past and future, finally. Working in harmony? Word spread quickly through the small Texas town. The diner buzzed with conversations about solar panels and smart irrigation systems, about a billionaire CEO who mucked out stables and a stubborn rancher who'd opened his mind to change. Some called it the end of an era. Others saw the beginning of something new. "Show them," Jack said to Sophie one morning, as a group of neighboring ranchers gathered at the Coleman place. She stood in the stable, tablet in hand, demonstrating how Anderson Tech's AI could predict health issues in horses' days before visible symptoms appeared. "Thunder here showed early signs of joint stress," she explained, pulling up the data. "The sensors in his stable detected subtle changes in his movement patterns. We adjusted his exercise routine, and look at him now." The magnificent horse pranced in his stall, the very picture of health. Old Tom Baker, who'd been breeding horses longer than Sophie had been alive, stepped forward to examine the readings. "Fancy gadgets are one thing," he said gruffly, "but knowing horses, that's something else." He looked at Jack. "Your daddy would have had thoughts about all this." "My father adapted when tractors replaced horses," Jack replied quietly. "He installed computers when everyone said books were good enough. He knew the ranch had to evolve to survive." Sophie watched the exchange, holding her breath. Tom's opinion carried weight in the community. After a long moment, the old rancher nodded. "Show me how these sensors work," he said to Sophie. "Got a mare that's been troubling me." By midday, 3 more ranchers had signed up to test Anderson Tech's systems. Sarah worked the phones, fielding calls from agricultural newspapers, wanting to cover the story. But it wasn't just about publicity anymore. It was about proving their concept worked. "The soil moisture sensors saved the Johnsons' alfalfa crop," Jack told Sophie as they walked the fence line. "And the Miller sisters are using the market prediction AI to time their cattle sales. It's not replacing their knowledge. It's supporting it." Sophie stopped to watch a drone survey the north pasture, its cameras mapping the land for optimal grazing rotation. "And the bank? Sarah says they're cautiously optimistic." Jack smiled. "Having Anderson Tech's backing changes everything, but it's more than that. They can see this is sustainable, not just financially, but culturally." In town, the local coffee shop had set up free Wi-Fi and a dedicated space for ranchers to learn. The new systems. Sophie found herself giving impromptu tech support between conference calls with her board, watching with pride as weathered hands learned to navigate touchscreens. "Never thought I'd see the day," the cafe owner remarked, watching. 70-ish Martha Wilson enthusiastically show her grandson how to read crop health data on her new tablet. But times change, don't they? They did indeed. The Coleman Ranch became a hub of activity, with regular workshops bringing together tech experts and experienced ranchers. Knowledge flowed both ways, Sophie's team learning as much about practical agriculture as they taught about technology. "Your father would be proud," Sarah told Jack one evening, as they watched Sophie lead a group of local teens through the basics of coding weather monitoring systems. "He always said the ranch needed young blood, new ideas." Jack nodded, remembering his father's words about adaptation and survival. "And her father would be proud too," he said, thinking of the principles Anderson Tech had been founded on. "She's proving that technology can preserve traditions instead of replacing them." The sunset painted the scene in warm colors. Robots monitoring cattle alongside cowboys on horseback, tablets displaying centuries-old farming wisdom enhanced by artificial intelligence, elderly ranchers teaching young programmers about weather patterns while learning about data analysis. Sophie joined them on the porch, slipping her hand into Jack's. "The board meeting's tomorrow," she reminded him softly. Worried, she looked out over the ranch at the seamless blend of old and new they'd created. "No," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "For the first time, I know exactly what I'm fighting for, and I know I'm not fighting alone." The Anderson Tech boardroom felt different now. Sophie stood at the head of the conference table, her presentation ready, but her mind was partly back in Texas. Jack had offered to come with her, but this was one battle she needed to fight alone. "Miss Anderson," Richard Wells began, his tone carefully measured. "While your rural experiment is interesting, Meridian's offer remains the safest option for our shareholders." Sophie looked around the table at the faces she'd known for years. Some supportive, some skeptical, all waiting to see how the farm girl playing CEO would justify turning down $30 billion. 2 weeks ago, she began, I would have stood here with charts and projections. I would have talked about market penetration and quarterly earnings, but today I'm going to tell you about a horse named Thunder. The board members stirred uncomfortably. The Meridian executives exchanged glances. Thunder was the first test subject for our AI health monitoring system, but he taught us something more valuable, that the best technology doesn't replace human experience, it enhances it. She clicked to her first slide, showing real data from the Coleman ranch. What you're seeing isn't lab results, it's real-world application. Back in Texas, Jack sat in his father's old office staring at the bank's final notice. The deadline was tomorrow, but now he had options. Sophie's proposal would save the ranch, but it would change it forever. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes holding on to something means letting it grow. In San Francisco, Sophie was hitting her stride. The Coleman Ranch project isn't just about saving one farm. It's proof that Anderson Tech can fulfill its original mission, using technology to preserve what matters while building a sustainable future. She showed them the numbers, adoption rates among local farmers, improved crop yields, reduced water usage, healthier livestock. But more importantly, she showed them the people, generations of ranching families embracing innovation without losing their identity. Meridian wants to strip Anderson Tech down to its profitable components, she continued. But our value isn't in our parts, it's in our vision. The same vision my father had when he wrote our first line of code. Richard Wells leaned forward. This is all very touching, Sophie, but sentiment doesn't pay dividends. No, Sophie pulled up the latest projections. Our agricultural AI division has seen a 300% increase in interest since the Coleman Ranch project began. Real farmers are signing up for real solutions. We're not just selling technology anymore, we're preserving a way of life. Her phone buzzed. A message from Jack. Whatever you decide, we'll figure it out together. The simple text gave her strength. She looked at the Meridian executives with their sleek suits and calculated smiles. My father built this company to prove that profit and purpose could coexist. The Coleman Ranch proves he was right. And what if we don't share your romantic vision? Richard challenged. What if the board votes to accept Meridian's offer? Sophie straightened. Then I'll resign and start over, because I'd rather build something meaningful from scratch than watch everything my father and I created become just another corporate casualty. The boardroom erupted in murmurs. Sophie stood firm, channeling the quiet strength she'd learned from Jack. Sometimes you had to risk everything to save what mattered. Miles away, Jack made his own decision. He signed the papers Sarah had prepared, officially making the Coleman Ranch a pilot site for agricultural innovation. His father had adapted to tractors and computers. Now it was his turn to adapt, to ensure the ranch survived for another generation. In San Francisco, the board called for a vote. Sophie held her breath, thinking of Thunder's gentle eyes, of Jack's calloused hands, of old Tom Baker learning to use a tablet, of progress and tradition finding a way to dance together. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain. Sometimes the hardest choices led to the truest answers. 6 months later, the Coleman Ranch had become something neither Jack nor his father could have imagined, yet somehow exactly what it was always meant to be. Solar panels gleamed alongside the weathered barn, powering both the ranch and feeding. Excess energy back to the local grid. Smart irrigation systems preserved precious water while maintaining the lush grazing lands. But it was still, undeniably, a working ranch. Your father would have loved this, Sarah said, watching Jack demonstrate the new breeding program software to a group of visiting ranchers. The program combined traditional breeding wisdom with AI-driven genetics analysis, producing healthier horses than ever before. Thunder's latest foal pranced in the distance, a perfect blend of classic bloodlines and modern science. The old stallion watched proudly from his tech-enhanced stable, where sensors monitored his health around the clock. In the converted barn that now served as Anderson Tech's rural headquarters, Sophie was holding a virtual board meeting. The company's stock had hit record highs since their agricultural division took off, with the Coleman ranch model being replicated across the country. The Singapore team reports similar success with their local farms, Marcus announced. It turns out ranchers everywhere face the same challenges, and they all want the same thing, to preserve their way of life while staying viable. Richard Wells, who had chosen to stay after losing the Meridian vote, grudgingly added, "The ethical technology approach is proving more profitable than traditional aggressive expansion. Who would have thought?" Sophie smiled, remembering her father's words about profit and purpose coexisting. Through the barn's window, she could see local teenagers in the new training center, learning to code while getting hands-on farming experience. The program had already produced 2 patents for agricultural innovations. The town itself was transforming. The influx of tech workers had brought new life to local businesses, while the ranching community's strong traditions kept the area's character intact. The diner now served both chicken fried steak and vegan options, while the old feed store had a corner dedicated to tech support. "It's like the best of both worlds," the diner's owner told anyone who'd listen. "We're growing without losing who we are." Jack walked into the barn just as Sophie was ending her meeting. He still wore his working clothes, but now a tablet shared pocket space with his work gloves. "The Australian ranchers are here," he said. "Ready to see how we're doing things?" Sophie nodded, gathering her materials. Together, they headed out to meet their visitors. The Australian group represented dozens of family farms looking to modernize without selling out to corporate agriculture. "The key," Jack explained as they walked, "is understanding that technology shouldn't replace traditional knowledge. It should enhance it." He gestured to an old-timer working with a young programmer in the field. "When you bring the 2 worlds together, both get stronger." The Australians watched, impressed, as drones helped cowboys herd cattle more efficiently, while AI systems predicted market prices to ensure the best time for sales. But what really caught their attention was how natural it all felt. No stark division between old and new, just seamless integration. "We're not just preserving a way of life," Sophie added. "We're helping it evolve, like it always has. Ranching survived the transition from horses to tractors. Now it's surviving the transition to digital age." That evening, as the sun set behind the solar panels, Jack and Sophie sat on the porch swing that had held generations of Colemans. Thunder grazed nearby, his foal romping in grass, kept perfect by sophisticated moisture monitoring. "My father used to say that legacy isn't about keeping things exactly the same," Jack mused. "It's about keeping the heart of something alive, even as its body changes." Sophie leaned against him, watching the stars emerge above their modernized piece of Texas heaven. "And your legacy? What do you think that will be?" Jack smiled, pulling her closer. "Maybe it's proving that love can bridge any gap, even the one between a cowboy and a tech CEO." The Coleman Ranch had hosted many gatherings over the generations, but none quite like this. White chairs dotted the green pasture where Thunder's foal now grazed, and fairy lights twinkled in the ancient oak trees. Tech executives in designer suits mingled with ranchers in their Sunday best, while reporters discreetly documented what they were calling the merger of Silicon Valley and the American heartland. Sarah supervised the final arrangements, her real estate agent's eye for detail, ensuring everything was perfect. "Only my brother," she laughed, "would insist on having his horse as his best man." Indeed, Thunder stood proudly near the altar, freshly groomed and sporting a bow tie. The old stallion had earned his place of honor, having unknowingly started this whole story with a fateful ride. In the farmhouse, Sophie sat in what had been Jack's mother's room, now modernized, but still maintaining its rustic charm. Her wedding dress captured the spirit of their union. Elegant but understated, with hand-stitched lace from a local artisan overlaying silk from a San Francisco designer. "Your father would have loved this," Marcus said softly, adjusting her. A veil. He'd insisted on giving her away, having been the closest thing to family she'd had for years. Both the tradition and the innovation. Outside, the guests represented the beautiful complexity of their merged worlds. Old Tom Baker sat next to a venture capitalist, enthusiastically explaining the benefits of AI-assisted horse breeding. The local diner owner had catered alongside a Michelin-starred chef, creating a menu that celebrated both down-home cooking and haute cuisine. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of blending old and new. A string quartet played alongside a local country band. The wedding arch combined wildflowers with sophisticated lighting designed by Anderson Tech's engineers. Even the vows were a mixture of time-honored promises and modern sentiments. Jack waited. At the altar, wearing a custom suit that somehow looked natural with his cowboy boots. His eyes never left the farmhouse door, waiting for his bride. When Sophie appeared, the setting sun caught the subtle, tech-enhanced shimmer in her veil, a gift from her R&D team, creating a gentle glow that seemed to symbolize the magic of their unlikely union. Thunder stomped his hoof at the perfect moment, making everyone laugh as Sophie reached the altar. The minister, who'd baptized Jack as a baby and now led the local church's online ministry, smiled at the couple. "Love," he began, "is like good ranching and good business. It takes tradition and innovation, respect for the past and courage to embrace the future. These two people before us prove that the greatest partnerships don't erase differences. They celebrate them." The vows they'd written together captured their journey. Jack spoke of learning to open his heart to change, of finding strength in adaptation rather than weakness. Sophie promised to always keep one foot on the ground, to remember that the greatest innovations come from understanding what's worth preserving. Thunder contributed his own approval with a gentle whinny as they exchanged rings, simple bands, that contained sophisticated tech, allowing them to feel each other's heartbeats. "What God and good Wi-Fi have brought together," the minister said with a twinkle in his eye, "let no man put asunder." The celebration afterward was a testament to their success at bridging worlds. Line dancing mixed with electronic music, barbecue brisket was served alongside sushi. Children taught their grandparents to use the augmented reality photo booth, while cowboys explained the finer points of roping to software engineers. Sarah's toast brought tears to every eye. "My brother always said he'd never change," and Sophie was famous for disrupting traditional industries. But love has a way of teaching us that the best change happens when we honor where we came from while bravely stepping into where we're going. Marcus followed with his own speech, recalling the day Sophie had declared her need to disappear. She was looking for something real in a virtual world. She found it in the most unexpected place, proof that sometimes the best innovations aren't the ones we plan, but the ones that life surprises us with. As evening fell, Jack led Sophie onto the dance floor for their first dance. Above them, drones created constellations in the sky, while fireflies provided nature's own light show. They danced to a song that mixed country guitar with electronic rhythms, created specially for them by a Nashville producer and a DJ working together. "Happy?" Jack whispered in her ear. Sophie looked around at their perfect blend of worlds, at Thunder watching contentedly from his tech-enhanced stable, at their families and communities becoming one, at the ranch that now represented the future of agriculture while honoring its past. "More than happy," she replied. "I'm home." 1 year later, a familiar scene played out on the dusty road leading to the Coleman ranch. A woman in a designer dress stood by the fence, but this time she wasn't lost or running away. Sophie was exactly where she belonged, waiting for a group of young tech entrepreneurs to arrive for Anderson Tech's new Rural Innovation Program. Thunder's foal, now a strong yearling, grazed nearby while sensors monitored his health. The old stallion himself enjoyed a well-earned retirement, though he still carried Jack and Sophie on occasional sunset rides. Some traditions were too precious to give up. "Remember when you found me here?" Sophie asked, as Jack joined her by the fence. "I thought I was just looking for a temporary escape, and I thought I was just helping a stranded stranger," he chuckled, pulling her close. Funny how life works. Out. The ranch had become a model of sustainable innovation, proving that progress didn't have to come at the cost of tradition. Family farms across the country were adopting their methods, preserving their heritage while embracing the future. Anderson Tech's agricultural division had become its fastest-growing segment, with Sophie and Jack regularly traveling to help other communities find their own balance between old and new. Sarah had turned their story into a successful consulting business, helping other rural communities modernize without losing their soul. The town itself had become a case study in thoughtful development, maintaining its character while welcoming new opportunities. "Your father would be proud," Jack said softly, watching a drone herd cattle alongside a young cowboy. "Both our fathers would be." Sophie smiled, her hand resting on her slightly swollen belly. Their first child would be born into a world where tradition and innovation danced in harmony, where future and past weren't enemies, but partners in progress. The nursery upstairs combined hand-carved furniture passed down through generations, with cutting-edge monitoring technology, much like everything else on the ranch. As the sun began to set, painting the solar panels and old barn in shades of gold, a new car appeared on the horizon. Another visitor coming to learn their secrets, to understand how love had bridged the gap between two worlds and created something better than either could have imagined alone. "Ready to change more lives?" Jack asked, taking her hand. Sophie looked at their joined hands, his calloused from honest work, hers still elegant but now equally comfortable with ranch life. "Always," she replied, "as long as we do it together." Behind them, thunder whinnied softly, as if remembering that first fateful ride. Some people said it was just luck, a billionaire's car breaking down at exactly the right ranch. But Sophie and Jack knew better. Sometimes the heart finds its home in the most unexpected places, and the greatest innovations come from having the courage to take a chance on love.